Hello and welcome to Amigos IAS. I am Adnan. 2 days ago, the 28th Conference of Parties concluded in UAE and a consensus was achieved on some of the important issues of climate negotiations. The most important being the fossil fuels. And this particular conference was quite important because this was the first global stocktake after the Paris climate deal, which was signed in the year 2015. So let us try to understand what are the outcomes achieved in this conference and what are the things which were missed out. So let's start with the basic points. The COP summit has given the declaration at the end talking about transitioning towards reduction of the fossil fuels. That means transitioning away from fossil fuels was mentioned here, and it was said that it is the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. I will be discussing what is the problem with this particular declaration eventually. Just hold on. Okay, it talks about equitable transition underpinned by deep emission cuts and scaled up finance. It looks quite generic in nature. Let us try to decode this statement in our lecture. So what is global stocktake? What I just mentioned here. It means it's like a progress card because many countries have taken the targets of reducing the emissions. Now, what has happened in the last 8 years? Because the Paris climate deal concluded in the year 2015. From then till now, 8 years have lapsed. And in these 8 years, did the countries actually stay true to the commitments which they have given on reducing emissions or not? So it's a progress card. It's like a review. That is what is called as global stocktake. It's an assessment because the Paris climate deal has given the target that in order to not have adverse impacts of climate change beyond which the humans cannot absorb, we need to reduce the emissions to below 2 degrees Celsius when we compare to the pre-industrial era, ideally at least by 1800 AD. That means the average rise of temperatures should not be more than 2 degrees Celsius compared to this era, and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius we also have to target at least 2, okay, or ideally ambitious target is 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is the point here. Now what is going to happen is next summit, this was COP28, right? So next summit COP29 is going to be in Azerbaijan, and in COP30 which is going to take place in 2025 in Brazil, there is going to be another important aspect. What is that? New plans should be given to the COP30. That means the new emission targets whatever the countries have, what they gave in 2015, and now they have to scale up the targets to reduce the emissions. That will happen in 2030, 2025, which is in the COP30 conference in Brazil. So we need to wait until then. Now the next aspect here, as I just told you, generally the developed countries used to give commitments because the Kyoto Protocol of 2005 has given the target for the developed countries, not the developing countries, to reduce the emissions. Why Paris climate deal was important? Because now you are bringing the entire the world. That means even developing countries now have to give some targets to reduce the emissions. So I hope you understood the point here. Developed countries already used to be giving the targets as a part of Kyoto Protocol signed in the year 2005. Now even developing countries, let's say India and China, these countries also have to give the targets to reduce the emissions. That is the importance of the Paris summit here. Fine. And those targets what the countries gives are called as INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. Every country has to give the targets of how much emission intensity they are going to reduce by, let's say, 2025 or 30. That is called as NDCs or INDCs. So it was decided that the countries will assess their progress for the first time in this current year, and already summit already has been concluded. That is the point what we have understood so far. Now let us see one by one each of the important outcomes and their lacuna. So first one is what the major flashpoint is, what fossil fuel phase out. Now the word phase out, even though I wrote here the word fossil fuel phase out, it was not there in the final draft, final declaration. Because in the original text what they have proposed is that we need to transition away from fossil fuels and give a proper target or the date by which we are going to phase out the fossil fuels. But many countries are dependent on the fossil fuels. USA also is a very important producer of this fossil fuels. And then we have countries like, we call them as petro countries, oil countries. Let's say the West Asian countries are there, and UAE itself, Saudi Arabia, many countries, Russia, these are all petro countries. These countries are dependent, their economies are dependent on the fossil fuels, and these countries would not like any binding commitments to reduce the fossil fuels. And as we all know, the fossil fuels create more and more greenhouse gas emissions which warm the entire earth, and it results into the climate change. So climate change is not new to earth, but current climate change, what we are seeing right now, it is accelerating because of humans. That is the point here. Fine. So the role of fossil fuels already we know, but it has never been acknowledged in the previous conference of parties, but this is the first time some mention has been done. But it fell short because it did not talk about phasing out, but rather a very vague word was used called as transitioning away from fossil fuels. That is the term which was used in the final text here, because we want to achieve the net zero targets. That means the balance of emissions over capture of the carbon, that is called as net zero. We want to achieve that by 2050. India wants to achieve by 2070. That is another target for us. Production and consumption of fossil fuels are unlikely to be curbed in the near term because this particular COP28 UAE Consensus has fallen short of giving a proper timeline to reduce the fossil fuels. That is the COP down we can say here. Fine. Now next one, tripling of renewable energy, because we want to reduce the use of the dirty energy which is the fossil fuels, the natural gas. We want to go towards renewable energy, and the target was to triple the renewable energy, okay, and also double the energy efficiency. So we want to target 10,000 gigawatts of clean energy. That is one target we have, and also doubling of the annual improvements in energy efficiency. That is very important for us. Okay, so together these measures can reduce how much of CO2? 7 billion tons of CO2, okay, from now till 2030 if we actually achieve the target of tripling of renewable energy. But the problem is what? This was a statement which was given in generic way. It did not talk about which countries have to be achieving this target. For example, let's say it's a global target. It is not incumbent on every country to individually triple its current installed capacities. India is already doing it, but many countries are not able to do it because it is not so cheap also. You need to do investment, you need some finances. So that means this target is very good, of course, but it does not put any commitment on all the countries to achieve this tripling of renewable energy capacity. That is what also a loophole we can say. Next one, phasing down of coal. Now interesting point here. Now this particular thing was discussed in COP26 in Glasgow, that we want to phase down the coal. Many developing countries still are dependent on coal for their development. Countries like India and China, India produces coal, India also imports coal in millions of tons, 140 million tons at India imports the coal. The point is, this also divided the north and south further, because fossil fuels, they don't want to use the word phase down or phase out. But for coal, the word phase down is used. That means they want to reduce the coal, which developing countries will use more, but they don't want to put any commitment on fossil fuels, which more developed countries will use. So understand this dichotomy between the northern and southern countries. That means the global north and global south, which are the developed world and the developing world. So this one is one statement, because there is no one requirement. What is there? Okay, coal has got more attention because it is more destructive. Okay, so you can see here, no new coal-fired power plants, okay, could be opened without an inbuilt carbon capture and storage facility. That was a condition, okay, but this was resisted by India and China, South Africa, other developing countries, because if we accept this proposal, we need to again increase our investments, and whatever the coal-fired power plants are there itself we have to capture the emissions as well, and we need to invest more money on that. So as of now, developing countries don't want such kind of binding commitments. It was dropped, and finally the earlier Glasgow conference declaration was there. What is that? We need to phase down the coal, okay, and from what baseline, nothing was being mentioned, okay, it's a general term that you need to reduce the use of coal. That is another outcome here. And next one is what? Methane emissions. As we know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It stays roughly around 12 years in the atmosphere, short-lived gas compared to CO2, which stays for centuries. But methane is very much potent because it has been responsible for 30% of the current warming what we are seeing, emissions what we are seeing. And see here, for nearly 25% of emissions, okay, or 30% by some other statistics. That much emissions come because of methane itself. It is about 80 times more potent than CO2 in causing global warming. It is short-lived, but it causes more damage. So we need to target the methane reduction. That is a more important point, okay. But these reductions can bring substantial benefits. That means it is more potent than CO2. Even if today we try to reduce the CO2, whatever CO2 already is there in the atmosphere will stay for hundreds of years. But if you actually remove methane immediately now, what happens? Because methane will not survive for long terms. If you remove methane now itself, it means if you reduce the methane now, it is going to reduce the global warming. So that logic is very important here. So, but what is happening here? Methane emissions are tied to agriculture and livestock, which developing countries will use most, like India. So, we don't want any kind of binding commitments to cut the methane emissions, because if we accept that, we need to change some of the agricultural patterns of India, and livestock rearing also we have to change in India. We don't want to afford to have the investments to reduce our agricultural patterns, because in India agriculture is mostly subsistence based, unlike in the western countries which is more corporate farming is there. So there has been no binding reduction on the methane emissions, but in Glasgow at least 100 countries have told that they are going to reduce the methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So that will continue, but in the fresh COP28, not any targets were given to reduce the methane, but a general statement was given. What? That we need to see here. We need to reduce the emissions by 2030. That is what was told, but no binding commitments are there here also. And next one, on the first day of the summit, an important long-standing demand was there called as LDF, Loss and Damage Fund. Now, climate finance is a very big topic. You need to read up on Adaptation Fund, Green Climate Fund, as well as Global Environment Facility. There are many funds. Please read up on that for the exam purpose. As of now, LDF. This was a very long-standing proposal agreed in 2013 in the Warsaw COP conference. And finally, after 10 years, it has been operationalized. Last summit in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt also, they talked about setting up the fund, but they could not. But now in COP28, finally, in the first day itself, they have operationalized this fund, which means the countries, any country, can give some amount of money to this particular fund. And this fund is managed by the World Bank. And in this fund, what happens is, this fund is used by those vulnerable developing countries or LDCs, least developing countries, who can access the fund if they are impacted by the climate change, the disasters which come because of that. So see here, a decision was taken last time, but it has not been created. That means COP27, they tried, but they could not. Idea came in 2013 itself, guys. Fine, no money has been promised, but now this particular summit has operationalized on the day of the first day itself. And see here, almost $700 million have been put in this particular fund. So far, many countries have offered their contributions, but 700 is peanuts here. We need billions of dollars and sometimes trillions also. Why? Because we need to help the poor countries recover from the climate-induced disasters. They are not responsible for the emissions, but they are paying the cost for that. Because the industrialized countries, during the industrial revolution phase from then onwards, they are the historical drivers of climate change, but they don't accept that. That is the problem. That is the heart of these climate negotiations. Fine. So this fund is good. It's a victory, we can say. A long-standing demand it was, but it fell short of. This fund is very less. We hope it will increase in the future. We need billions of dollars. And the last one is what? Global goal on adaptation. So mitigation is different from adaptation. Mitigation is reducing the harmful impact, we can say, or reducing the emissions which causes climate change. Adaptation is a long-term strategy, because adaptation means what? It is accepted that we are going to face the problems because of this climate change. Now you need to make some changes in your country. Let's say, for example, building some embankments, building some flood protection programs, or we can say infrastructure. Now it is a given that early warnings of the, we can say, cyclones, we have to increase, we have to adapt ourselves to the impact of climate change. It's a long-term goal, which is mostly localized in nature. In the entire negotiations of this climate deals, many times adaptation is not given much importance because it is mostly localized. Mitigation, which means what? Like reducing of emissions, that is given more importance, like already 1.5 degrees Celsius they have told. But they talked about some broader goals of how to go for adaptation. Again, adaptation means you need to scale up the finances. You need money to adapt yourself to the impacts of climate change. That money will not come because the poor countries will not have the finances. The developed countries have to fund this money. So there again not much progress has been done. So what is the point here? Developing countries have been arguing for a proper framework for adaptation. The Glasgow COP26 conference has told that we are going to have a 2-year program to define the contours of this framework, and this particular COP28 they discussed about this, but they have not given a proper outcome on that. So let us see the point here. So in the current conference what they have told is, okay, let us go for reduction in climate induced water scarcity. So water, agriculture, health, 3 components. Climate induced water scarcity, attaining climate resilience in food and agricultural production, supplies and distribution, okay, and climate induced health impacts. So agriculture, health and water, in these whatever the climate impacts are there, let us try to have a proper framework. Let us try to have some goals also. Like in what is the use of goals, guys, unless there is some kind of proper roadmap regarding the funding mechanism. So what happens here? It lacks financial provisions. No point of discussing all this unless you also talk about where the money should come to adapt to these things. Okay, so what is the point here? And countries would need to continue working on it to strengthen it in the coming years. So that is also quite vague in nature. Fine. See, unlike mitigation, where progress can be tracked by a single metric, we have to reduce this much of emissions. But okay. So to achieve this kind of target. But the point is, adaptation requires a more complex approach. It is much more dynamic in nature, much more comprehensive in nature. That is what is not being understood in this segment. So these are the basic things which were there. The key outcomes, what I can say from this current COP28 conference. But the important point is what India also tries to achieve in this. India, of course, is on point when it comes to achieving its climate targets. Climate justice means we are not seeing the climate change issue from environmental perspective. We are seeing the issue based on some ethical and moral perspectives, political perspectives also, because justice here means equity. Because the poor countries, developing countries, LDCs, they are not responsible for the current climate change here, global warming here, and the developed countries will refuse to take any responsibility here. So when I talk about the concept of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, a point to note here, when I talk about LDF, loss and damage fund, here the developed countries accepted to give the funds to LDF, but they did not accept it on the CBDR principle. That means what? They still do not want to accept their historical responsibility for the current emissions. That is where the climate justice topic comes here. Because if they accept, they have to give lot of what? Finances, technology transfer. This is very important component here. They have already committed in COP15 and COP21, $100 billion per year developed countries have committed, but they are not giving that amount. This is not operational. That means climate finance, technology transfer are the very important aspects here of climate justice. India proposed one initiative called as green credit system. I'll tell you very briefly what it is about. As we all know, carbon credits are traded in the market because everybody has some binding targets to reduce the emissions. Let's say a company has been given some target to reduce the emissions, and they managed to reduce the emissions much more than what they have to do. So now they can actually get the carbon credits because they have fulfilled their targets. Those credits they can actually trade in the market, and those who are not able to fulfill their commitment, they will purchase these carbon credits. Let's say, for example, I am given 100 units. I'll show a different slide here. Okay, let us say, for example, 100 units of emissions are permitted for your company, but you already crossed 120. Someone has crossed only 80. So they have 20 credits here, they can give to this company. That means these carbon credits can be used in the stock markets, whatever, on money, this other company will purchase this carbon credits because they overshot their targets. Similarly, the Indian government has proposed green credit system. Green credits means what? Not only for the emissions. If any company or any individual happens to do some initiative, for example, let's say water conservation, soil conservation, some good plans they have done, they should be credited for that as well, and they should be given some credits for that work also. Now, those credits for soil conservation or let us say water conservation can be traded in the market in the form of money. That is similar to carbon credits. So, that is a procedure where the government is trying to expand the scope of carbon credits by including green credits also. Carbon credits talk about the emissions mostly. Green credits talk about what? Other aspects of saving of environment as well. So, this is the conclusion of our class. If you have any questions, please do post in the comments. See you and please keep watching Amigos IAS. Thank you.